Note how the memories from 10 years ago to last week, how they're fiction and how as real as they seem to be, they also aren't exactly. And note more about the process and the genre problem of it all. The Lynchpin. Thinking about all that time in college, I don't know what I learned or what it was. It was just a year among many others, but to revisit it at this point with the perspective of today and to try to find some way of looking at it that's more positive. I suppose when it comes to the heartbreak, there was no way I was going to end up with that girl. I don't know how I saw the world before then, that kind of rejection. I'm just sitting here thinking about it, trying to remember it. I feel like the power that I have comes from writing and finding my integrity in the sheer volume of the work. Miriam just walked into the office and said, "Joshy, I wore this to my 20th birthday party." It was a warm white or beige-ish color and fit her as well as it probably would have then. I spent most of the day editing. When I called my parents to check in, my dad was in the garage shredding papers, which was a good sign. It meant he had some energy. All of the records from his office, boxes full. The paper shredder could handle 3 or 4 pages at once, or else it would jam. And still it would jam. The job is undoubtedly meticulous. My therapist had sent me some ideas about emotional regulation, dopamine, cortisol, and oxytocin. I think it came up when I was talking about how I'd lost my temper with my sister when the cortisol spiked. But the past week since I'd been home from Calgary, I felt like I'd been stable enough. Oxytocin. I feel like when it comes, the dopamine comes forward and stamps it out. I thought about the dopamine and how it had a way of pushing me to stay in that deficit in order to be alone and write and to feel like I'm working towards something. It is why the need to write a novel is crucial for survival, because of how ephemeral all of the work can feel if it is not building towards something that can transcend the ordinary, a sense of purpose, of worth. We planned to go for a walk to get floss from Shoppers. Miriam got dressed in the outfit she wanted to wear for dinner before we left, so that she would be ready to leave and wouldn't be late. It began to rain lightly when we were getting ready to leave. She didn't want her pants to get wet. I told her to go ahead and change them. I would get Nora ready in the stroller. It was okay. She said it would take too much time. I could see that the pressure was building in her. She gets a certain way when she needs to be somewhere at a certain time. She's never late. It's a quality I admired immensely. I took being on time very seriously as well. It shows that your time is respected, that they put effort in to be there, that some sacrifice was made on their behalf to hold up their end of the deal. But that quality that she had that I admired so much didn't come without effort, and I could see the stress was building. I told her we didn't need to get more floss. We could do it later. We could just go on a short walk instead, because I didn't want to deal with the pressure. When she came back down, I could see in the way that she was walking that there was something there. When we crossed the street, she said, "That was mean the way you said you didn't want to deal with it." We talked about it. There was something about her getting angry like that. As much as I didn't want to be fighting, as frustrating as it was to see her open up and talk about her feeling, made me close to her. I tried to not fight back, to apologize. It was good to adjust the plan, to acknowledge the pressure, but to do it in a way that wasn't as harsh, as mean. It was similar to why my sister wouldn't talk to me for those months, of what I was reading back before we went to Calgary. Instead, I continued along with the editing. I went through everything I'd written before we went to Calgary at the end of last year, before my dad's diagnosis. I could see, despite all the new love that I felt for Nora when she was so small, less than 6 months old, how much I struggled to adjust to this new life, having quit my teaching job to be a stay-at-home dad, how monotonous those days could be, despite the overwhelming joy. We came home and I had therapy. In therapy, we talked about a certain time in my life when I'd first gone to college. It was prompted by a question she'd asked about any teachers I'd had over the years, any mentors that I'd looked up to. I was reminded of a certain time in my life when I was around 20 years old. My first year of college, I was studying English literature at Mount Royal College in Calgary. My girlfriend at the time, who I'd been with for 3 years or so, was studying there as well. I had a professor there. He taught poetry, the Norton Anthology. He taught us John Donne, Alexander Pope, Keats, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Yeats, and William Carlos Williams. The depth in which he was able to show us behind the poems he'd selected, as I reflect on it now, I don't know if there was another time in my life that I was as profoundly moved, not necessarily in the emotional qualities of the poems, but rather the technical depth in which he looked at them. It was a difficult class. His breadth of knowledge was entirely formidable. I remember the impression I had from the students around me. They were dead bored. I remember at one point a bunch of the students were talking about a trip they were going on. They were going to Mexico for a week during spring break. He said what we should do, if we wanted to write, was to go to Rome and sit on a park bench. And that summer I did so. I went to Rome and I sat on a park bench. I explored Europe for a few weeks with a tiny backpack. I sat in parks and tried to write. At one point I'd gone about 4 days without speaking to anyone. I remember how strange and difficult it felt to be that isolated, to have only my notebook to write in and my books to read. I would go to internet cafes to check my email and to write to my parents and my girlfriend back home. As I walked endlessly up and down the streets, I began to notice some strange growth, what seemed like a third testicle. I remember lying in a cot somewhere, feeling nauseated by the idea of my mortality. When I arrived back at my apartment, my girlfriend came over and broke up with me upon arrival. I was blindsided and devastated. Eventually, I would find out that she cheated on me. She had a threesome while on mushrooms in a rooftop swimming pool at some expensive hotel downtown. I got the growth checked out. It was an abdominal hernia. They would need to do an operation to repair it. I felt a perpetual rage from the heartbreak I felt from the breakup. I don't know what kind of voice I had to write at that time. I just remember having my grandfather's old IBM electric typewriter set up by my bed. I remember looking out the window and smoking cigarette after cigarette, trying to find some kind of power. The humiliation and shame I felt from being cheated on, I could see how it was still there. After the summer ended, I went back to find that professor to tell him that I'd done what he said. I'd gone to Rome and sat on a park bench. I couldn't seem to locate him, so I went to some admin desk and asked. The woman there told me that over the summer he'd passed away. I think it was due to a sudden heart attack. I didn't know what to make of that. It's not that I knew him well at all, but I'd imagined for those months what it would be like to tell him about what it was like to look at the world. I remember standing in the university library one day, reading and being high, that everything I needed to know was right in front of me. I think I knew that I wasn't going to be able to get through. I made the decision that I would leave, but I promised myself that I would write. I would do everything I could to focus on that. I remember sitting with my parents and telling them that I was going to leave school, that I was going to write. I remember the disappointment on my mom's face, and I remember my dad saying nothing. To articulate all of this into some chronology that makes sense, it helps in a way to realize parts of the pain and the regret and the embarrassment of it all. I know how disconnected and broken that I had felt at that point, but the more I thought about it, thinking of my life before then, I was just stacking more bullshit on top of a black hole of pain that had already been with me. It was part of a much longer story, but this particular time seemed especially acute. To process it and to find a way to grow from it, that was the task, but I couldn't see it. It just seemed like a year of failure and shame. As I was putting all of this in order and trying to make some sense of it, to try to process it and frame it in a way that I could grow from it, Miriam's friends came over with their husband and her baby. I stayed writing for an hour or so until I felt like I was being too much of a prick not going down to socialize. I went downstairs. They were outside on the deck. Their baby was only a few days younger than Nora was. They asked me what I was writing about. I said it was about everything that was going on. There are often times where I try to articulate what I'm writing about and I totally break under it. I think the reason being, for me, if I actually knew what I was writing, I wouldn't feel the need to write it. That is the point. It seems it is often the case that once you know what you're writing, the work is done. The work is the process of figuring it out. That night, we had a bar mitzvah to go to, Miriam's cousin. Miriam and her mom left early and I stayed back to put Nora down. It had been a while since it was just me and Nora. We listened to Don DeLillo's Underworld and she played with her UFO toy. It seemed like now she was old enough to understand it. It kept her attention for a lot longer than before. We had a big dinner. I gave her avocado and oranges in a juice box, rice and beans, broccoli. After she ate, we spent half an hour slowly ripping pieces of an empty box of gluten-free matzah in half. Miriam's friend came over to watch Nora. She arrived as I was putting her down. We caught up for a bit as I cleaned up and waited for Nora to stop screaming on the monitor. She went quiet for a bit. It seemed like she was out. I put on my shoes and she began screaming again. I sat with Alice until she was done and then I left. I called my parents on the way to the subway station. It was bitter cold there. My dad said he pushed things too far, being in the garage and shredding paper, but he was feeling okay. I told him that the bar mitzvah was at the Hockey Hall of Fame. He had gone there once years earlier, before Nora, before I'd even met Miriam. He said the place was nothing special. He told me that I sounded tired not to stay late at the bar mitzvah. I went down into the building that the Hockey Hall of Fame was in, down the escalator to the food court. All of the restaurants were closed and gated off. A man drank something piss-colored from a plastic water bottle, and a guy whose eye was badly swollen. Miriam waited for me at the entrance. She told me what I'd missed. She said the music had been so loud that no one could hear each other, but the video they played was very sweet. I sat at the same table for most of the night. We sat bored. Relatives came over and talked. I had trouble putting on a version of myself that seemed exactly correct. I could smile and nod along and respond if prompted, but these kind of events... I tried to act engaged and kind with everyone that I spoke with. I think I did okay, but my dad was right. I was exhausted. At a certain point, I just stayed at the table while Miriam went off and talked to her cousins. Miriam's mom sat at the table across from me, and we didn't say much. I folded a cardboard square into a triangle. When we got home, Miriam opened the fridge and saw that I'd forgot to feed Nora her bottle before putting her to sleep. I could see how sad it made her. Something about that made me shut down. I went into bed and shut the light. I couldn't seem to bring myself to be able to say something. I was sad and pissed off. It was a lot later than I was used to being up. I woke up at 4 a.m. I went into my office and began writing a lot of half-incoherent thoughts. At around 8, Miriam was able to get me to come on a walk. It was quiet at first, but it all began to come out. How critical I was towards the people I spoke to at the bar mitzvah. How even though I knew how lucky I was that she involved me with her friends and family, I hated being away from my writing. I couldn't fucking stand it. I went over conversations I had, picking apart every detail of their idiocy, of my idiocy, and eventually I began to choke on my own words. Being there at the Hockey Hall of Fame, what my dad had said on the phone on the way there, because my dad had said that place was nothing special, but to me it was, because I'd been there with him. When I think of Miriam and I, what it means to be a father, to talk about our fathers, Miriam's dad, who lost his mind. Miriam was 12 at the time. The last time she saw him was at her bat mitzvah. She said he came to the synagogue and stood in the back. She said she remembers there was a large stain on his sweater. And my dad, who still had his mind, but there was a tumor growing on his brain. Glioblastoma, they called it. Her dad, a psychologist. My dad, a dentist. My dad was from Saskatchewan and moved a province west to Alberta. Her dad was from Manitoba and moved a province east to Ontario. Her grandparents, Holocaust survivors. Mine escaped the pogroms of the Russian Empire. And what to make of it all. What to make of what it means to be a dad. As we arrived back home, I opened the garage, and she pushed Nora's stroller towards me. I thought it was because you were just upset you forgot to give Nora her bottle, she said. Yes, I was, I told her.